You're listening to Love and Libido with me, your host, Dr. Emily Jamea. The goal of this podcast is to educate and inspire. My hope is that you will learn tools to create connection and cultivate passion, both within yourself and in your relationships. Here's what's coming up on today's episode.
One of the other dynamics that I picked up on as a physical therapist were that the women that I was treating, especially the young women or the newly married women or married women from more faith-based populations, there was, but not always, just even across the board, what I was seeing was this tendency to kind of dissociate from the treatment and just say, like, just fix me because I have to be able to function. I have to be able to allow sex to happen. I don't need to enjoy it. I just need to be able to tolerate it. And that just felt so, that was very jarring to me to hear as somebody who really appreciates sexual pleasure and the idea of, sex with meaning and connection. The idea that so many women were so willing to put aside their own expectation for pleasure just for the purpose of being able to function. And a lot of the anxiety behind functioning, what I recognized also had to do with social, cultural, and religious messages about being a good wife, a dutiful wife, an available wife to prevent sin. So a lot of my interest is also, if we look at the biopsychosocial model. So I do have some background regarding the biology, but I'm far more fascinated at this point exploring both the psychological, but also very much the sociological aspects, and not just of sexual pain, but of all sorts of what we see clinically.
Yeah, totally. And at that time, Talli, were you practicing in Israel?
Yeah.
You were, okay.
I've been living in Israel for about 26 years.
Okay.
So I begin I went to Northwestern in Chicago, so I did begin my career in Chicago, but I shortly after that, after about 10 years, moved to Israel and opened a practice in women's health physical therapy. And then after, I would say about 10 years in that, decided to shift gears and study for a master's in counseling and go into mental health.
Awesome. So it's sounding like I'm assuming that a lot of the women who you were treating were women who had internalized this belief that sex and pleasure should really be separate and that pleasure wasn't an important aspect or component of their sexuality, but their bodies were sending a different message. And and these women, I'm assuming, were women with really strong religious beliefs about sexuality.
I don't think that anybody was anti-pleasure. I think that ideally, pleasure is very valued, but I think that the anxiety over function was playing a greater role to the extent that pleasure was taking a back seat. And with that, I felt that I needed to kind of try and understand more.
And that's such a theme, I think, for women, regardless of their religious background, people who hold these stronger religious beliefs or who were told their whole, childhood or young adult lives that sex is something that is wrong, that you shouldn't do. And then suddenly they're married and it's okay. The body still holds on to a lot of fear and anxiety and messaging around sexuality.
Yeah. There's a lot to say. I mean, I think that across the board, what we know, at least about, for example, sexual pain disorders, is that women do have sex with pain because of mate guarding. And this is true in all cultures. That's not necessarily a religious thing. But when we do talk about the values of avoidance of or the prohibition of premarital sex, and then the sort of expectation of postmarital sex as a source of cognitive dissonance, I think that that's something that we certainly, sex therapists who do deal with at least the more orthodox segment of the population. We're talking about couples who really don't have any physical contact before marriage, and then they are expected to consummate the marriage shortly on the wedding night or shortly after. And so that introduces a whole set of potential challenges, not only with physical intimacy, but also with the establishment of and growth of and development of emotional intimacy, which often has not yet had an opportunity to take place.
Right. Can you explain that phrase cognitive dissonance to people who might not know what that means?
Well, I think that it's a situation where, you kind of have a message on one hand where, it's a strongly held belief, but it's a changed message. And so it doesn't make sense to you. Like the way that it might play out is a woman might say, I know that it is a positive commandment. We call it a mitzvah to have sex. But it doesn't feel like it. It feels like it's not the right thing to do. It might feel dirty or it might feel shameful because there hasn't really been a positive embodied experience of sex before marriage, or even with your own body, with your own kind of curiosity or awareness or self pleasure or any of that may not have been, most likely didn't take place in a context of permission, acceptance. I mean, that is changing in many areas. Certainly, the idea of widening knowledge and education is changing, and I think that what my podcast with Rabbi Scott Kahn, Intimate Judaism, is really about contributing to that voice of change, where there is a very much um, a strong commitment to tradition and to faith, but along with that, an understanding that um, that currently we need to be able to really address what the pitfalls are of a lack of education, of very fundamental beliefs and ideas about sexuality and sexual hierarchy, and and how we can kind of work with the current the kind of like the current environment,
Right.
and also introduce stronger ideas such as um, consent, enthusiastic consent, contraception, boundaries. Because if the standard mode of education was these are the religious laws, you shouldn't be, in seclusion with a member of the opposite sex, you shouldn't have physical contact with a member of opposite sex. If those laws aren't being observed that way, because you know in the olden days, you got to remember our religion is like 3,000 years old, right? So
Right.
what they did was people married very, very young.
Yeah.
And so you didn't really have time to develop much of a sense of self sexually. You just got married when it was time to start having sex.
Right. At a much
And
younger age.
yeah, so in a modern day world where people study and they go to college and they take a longer time to get married, there are people who obviously have a very well developed sense of their sexual desires and needs, and so many people are really not able to consider this idea of a complete abstinent life until marriage. So they may not have penetrative intercourse, but they may engage in other types of sex. So if the only sex education that they've had is that you're not allowed to do anything, then they may not really have a good sense of, other very important principles regarding sex, such as
Right.
pleasure, such as, being able to say no when something doesn't feel good to you, being able to stop an experience in the middle, being able to try something once but then not go back to it again if they change their mind. There's just like a lot to negotiate, consent especially,
Right.
because if those things, and for sure contraception, because if you don't have the education, you may not be prepared to enter into situations that you're not that you don't know could possibly result in a pregnancy.
Right. And I think obviously the education piece is so important. I listened to a couple of episodes of the podcast of your Intimate Judaism podcast, and I thought it was awesome. You and Rabbi,
Thank
remind me
you.
his name again.
Rabbi Scott Kahn.
Yes. Yeah. You and Rabbi Scott Kahn are just amazing as a team together. And I think anyone
Thank you.
listening who is interested in learning more about sex and Judaism should definitely go check it out, because I learned a lot just in the couple of episodes that I listened to. So I'm glad that
Thank you.
that's out there as a resource.
If you liked this video, drop me a like and subscribe below. Share with a friend who might find it interesting. You can also listen to this in podcast form anywhere podcasts are streamed by searching for Love and Libido with Dr. Emily Jamea. Finally, follow me across all social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamea for daily emotional and physical intimacy tips.